Meantime, we're focusing not only on what states and cities are doing to crack down and keep track of the pandemic. In case of New York, we told you they're doing these sort of security or virus checkpoints to make sure that you're not passing the virus into the Big Apple. In LA, if you're holding big parties and that sort of thing and going against COVID guidelines outlined by the mayor, they're just going to cut your power. I kid you not. Can they do that? John Pavia, the Quinnipiac Law Adjunct Professor, much more constitutional law expert as well. John, good to have you. That does seem to be one extra measure. It's one thing to annoy you with a survey or whatever in the New York metropolitan area. This is saying you hold a large party. Not only do you risk being fined, we'll cut your power. Can they do that?
So the answer is I don't know. And, can they do it? Yeah, they can do it in the short term. But I think you and I have talked about this in the past. It takes about 2.5 years for cases to go from the most states' lower level trial courts up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think we're going to find out a lot about what states, what the federal government, what cities are allowed to do coming out of this COVID experience that we're having. And what I mean by that is, every state, the federal government, the states, cities, they have two competing obligations, right? They have an obligation to provide things like utilities and water and electricity, and then there's an obligation to maintain peace and safety. And sometimes, as we're seeing right now, those things can come into conflict. And can a mayor by executive order tell the utilities to turn off the water? If someone is breaching the peace, my hunch is they can. And you're going to have to look at it's a city by city, state by state analysis. But we're all going to learn a lot, I think, in a couple of years, because I'm sure there's going to be cases that go up through the court systems, and they're all going to question what is a state, a city, a federal government's obligations and limitations when it comes to things like this in moments of crisis.
It's an interesting point you read that we might not be able to settle this legally for another couple of years, knowing the legal system, how long it takes. But I've talked to a lot of people, John, including a shop owner who was getting tickets and summonses for staying open when she shouldn't have stayed open. You hear about the one in Texas, of course, who had, a beauty salon, defied orders, a part of the city to stay open the way she did. And she was actually sent to jail for a little while before the governor sprung her. And I'm just wondering, for those who say, not paying this, not going to do this, it's one thing if the power's turned out of your place, you don't have many options, but what do they risk in the meantime in that 2.5, 3-year wait?
Well, look, I when I saw that case out of Texas, my first thought was this person clearly, in my opinion, got legal counsel who said, look, it's worth the risk, because by the time this case makes it, and I think in that case, there was a public outcry, and another public official bailed her out. But, I think for someone in a merchant who is, basically almost, going out of business, maybe on the verge of going out of business, there's no downside. I mean, for some of these folks to say, look, I'm opening up. But, it's going to be a very interesting, issue that makes its way through the courts, because and here's where, Neil, you and I have talked about some of this before, and I go back to, it's a bad analogy, but, the whole thing about getting a hold of the president's tax returns in Congress, whether or not there is a declaration made that there is some kind of national crisis or local crisis is important. And in the case of the president, whether or not they made a declaration that there was an impeachment investigation was important, because that declaration then transforms a lot of powers. In this case, when the federal government or a state government or a city declares some kind of emergency, different powers go into effect usually for that local, state, federal authority. And in this case, the question I think is going to be, was there a national crisis? Was there a state or city crisis? And if so, then how did that change the powers of the governing authority? And that is going to be the issue that will eventually make its way through the courts. And I think it'll be we're going to find out that the definitions that we think are in place or that we're living by, the courts are going to see very differently.
It's going to be an interesting thing to watch. John, thank you very much. In the meantime, good catching up with you, even virtually. John Pavia, on all of these fast-moving developments.